to Insignia's latest crisis management webinar. Thank you to all of the clients, partners and friends from within the area. And today we're here to talk about what is a critically important topic, which is fundamentally internal communications in a crisis, and in particular, how to secure employee trust, confidence and advocacy in a crisis, which certainly in my experience is a critical success factor. If you can keep the trust, confidence and support of your employees and turn them into advocates or ambassadors, it makes everything else so much easier. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jonathan Hemus. I'm Managing Director of Insignia. Again, for those of you who are meeting us for the first time, we're a specialist crisis management consultancy. We work with leaders of businesses around the world to help them do and say the right things on the most challenging days of their business lives. And we do that through crisis management planning, training, exercising, and sometimes advice during a crisis. My very first job, having left university 30-something years ago, was actually within internal communication. So I'm very passionate about this area, and I'm really pleased to be joined today by Alison Arnot, who I know is also very passionate about internal communication. She brings some great experience with her of life on the front line of internal communications in a crisis. And like me, she is so passionate about her topic that she has also written a book which was published recently. We're going to get a bit of an insight as to some of the topics within that book. Plot spoiler, Alison has kindly offered a discount code for anyone who would like to learn more about internal communication in a crisis. That will come up at the end of the webinar. So Alison, welcome and thank you for joining us today. Perhaps you could tell us just a little bit more about your experience and background.
Of course, thank you so much for having me, Jonathan. It's so nice to be here. Yes, my name's Alison. I'm a PR consultant and trainer. I'm based up in Scotland, but working across the whole of the UK. I specialise in internal communications, change communications, and crisis communications. I've been running my own business now for 12 years. Previous to that, I worked in-house. I worked in the financial services sector. I've worked in the rail industry. I've worked in the aviation industry, and I've worked in the university sector. As Jonathan says, I am absolutely passionate about internal communication in times of crisis, and that's based on my own experience. My experiences came early. Early in my career, I was head of employee communications for Glasgow, Edinburgh and Aberdeen airports, which is a very fancy title for the internal comms person for all of those airports, working with people across the organisation. And as part of that role, I also had on-call crisis responsibilities. So in other words, I was part of the on-call media team. And one Saturday afternoon back in 2007, I was pottering around my flat, having been out at a wedding the night before, so having a very lazy day, when the pager, and again this kind of gives away how old I am. I remember those, Alison. You remember them?
Oh yes.
The pager started beeping, and I wasn't on call, as I said, but it was going so much that I thought something is going on here, and I went and I took a look at the pager, and I saw that we had calls coming in from all over the world. So not just from the airport duty manager, but from Times of India is one that kind of stands out to me. There was publications in America as well as, BBC Scotland, all the usual people that we would expect at Glasgow Airport. So I contacted my colleague who was on call just to say what's happening. And he said, I'm at a barbecue and something has happened at the airport. I'm desperate to go. It's going to take me about an hour. And I said, listen, I'm really close. I will go. And then I'll go shopping afterwards. and you enjoy your barbecue. So I drove to the airport, saw the police cordon, and realised this is something very serious. And what it was actually a terror attack at the airport, which we hadn't realised at the point that the pager had started going off. So I was then involved in that crisis, in the crisis room, as part of the crisis management, crisis response team, and working kind of hybrid before hybrid was a thing, with the comms team, who were all in their own homes and so on, to deliver the first, I think it was probably about the first 7 hours of that response from within the crisis room. And then obviously in the weeks and months that followed, going back into my normal role of internal comms and media on call through the long tail of the crisis recovery. From there, I went into other jobs. I worked in the university sector. I've been self-employed, as I said, and I've been involved in other crisis and pre-crisis situations. And it has become clear to me as I've kind of gone through those situations that actually much of the response really has a huge amount to do with the people in the room and the people in the organisation outside of that room. And that's what really sparked my passion in internal communications in times of crisis, and that's my background.
Thanks, Alison. And that was a real baptism of fire within crisis communication, by the sound of it. I think those first experiences are very visceral, aren't they? And they stick in the memory, and you learn a lot from them.
You do. Yeah, you do. Absolutely, absolutely. It kind of it really shapes how you think about such things, and I think it builds your confidence, and it builds your crisis values as well. Yes. I think the team that I worked with at Glasgow Airport was excellent. The leadership team was excellent. The operational team was excellent. The business resilience team, the recovery team. Some of the people on the webinar today know some of these people. I know that, and they know how good they were. For me, that is everything. Having that strong team around you, and having that team that kind of can instill those ethical values and those values around transparency and so on, is really important in those early stages.
Yeah, I mean, I can only endorse that. We talk a lot about values in crisis, because the values that you display in a crisis are your true values. They may hopefully be the same as the ones on your website, but sometimes they're not. And when they're not, that's actually when we see organizations suffering the most harm. You really, really need to dig deep into your values at that time, or else make a bad situation even worse. And I think what you said about culture and teamwork and leadership is so important, and creating that psychological safety. Ultimately, all crises are about people, the people who are affected by a crisis and those that are responsible for dealing with it. So, okay, so we're going to open up this discussion. Alison and I are going to chat for the next half an hour or so, but there will be time for questions at the end. And if you do have questions, please can you post them via the chat box, the question box on your screen. We'll store those up, and then we will take those questions during the final 10 to 15 minutes of this session. So, as we've already touched on, Alison, clearly maintaining employee trust and confidence is really important in a crisis. And I want to kind of start our discussion by sharing a couple of real live and publicly available quotes from a couple of organizations that both went through a cyber attack round about the same time, but the public expressions of their employees at that time was quite different. So the first is Travelex, the foreign exchange company, who had a major cyber incident which took them down over Christmas about 4 or 5 years ago. The organization, in terms of its external comms, was quite tight-lipped. So, of course, the media went to their employees rather than their leaders to get quotes. And here's an actual quote from the BBC website from one of the Travelex employees. I couldn't help but laugh at the suggestion that the public response has been shockingly bad. This is nothing compared to how it's been handled internally. It feels like there is a distinct lack of real leadership and communication. At the same time, Norsk Hydro, which is an aluminium manufacturer, one of the world's biggest aluminium manufacturers based in Norway, also had a cyber attack which brought operations to a halt. One of their employees, quoted publicly, said, "The way we pulled together to get the company through the situation in one piece and get back into production has been an extreme team building session." Alison, do you recognise those kind of almost two extremes? And if so, why can we get such diverse reactions or responses from your people in a crisis?
Yeah, I do. I recognise both of them actually. Glasgow Airport very much felt like the second example. There have been others I won't mention that felt more like the first. And there's lots of different reasons people have different crisis experiences. So obviously, you know, there are things like the crisis type. In this case, it was both a cyber attack. So you might imagine the experiences would be similar. But of course they're not, because it's not just the crisis type that impacts on the crisis experience. We think about things like the cause, we think about things like the impact when we're thinking about our crisis response generally. But inside the organisation, even in a very similar type of situation, there will be differences. And it's those differences that lead to the different experience. So I wasn't involved in either of those crises. I know about them superficially, so I'm making assumptions, but I think we can make some fair assumptions here that in the situation where the staff really felt that this was a positive experience, that there would have been really strong leadership, there would have been really strong communication, and in the one where that wasn't felt the case, it would have been the opposite. So we can think about things like speed, for example. How quickly were employees kept up to date? Did they find out about their own crisis through their leaders, their line managers, their operational colleagues, or did they hear about it from someone else? How transparent was it? You know, I've heard of people in other organisations facing cyber incidents where the leaders have kind of gone on to lockdown. They've gone into a room by themselves with a bunch of people from outside of the organisation, locked themselves away and said nothing. And of course, that's really damaging, because the people outside the locked room, but inside the organisation, are still facing, you know, the blacked out screens, unable to do their work. They are getting more information potentially from social media or from people outside the organisation than they are from the people inside. So that really erodes trust. It makes them feel very undervalued in the organisation as well. And it makes them kind of feel less inclined to want to step in and help those leaders and help those external people who've been parachuted in when they finally turn around to them and ask for help. Other things though have an impact as well. The tone of the communication, how relevant the communication is to the people inside the organisation, how encompassing it is, whether there's opportunity for conversation, whether there's opportunity for feedback, whether there's opportunity for people to either share their ideas or just simply share their experiences. Again, we're talking here about the cyber incident. People have different needs in different types of crisis. So understanding not just the organisation the crisis existing in, but also the type of crisis has a real impact on the approach that we need to take to have kind of authentic and meaningful comms that is going to, you know, build that confidence, secure that trust, enable people to function within the organisation.
And something you touched on just a minute or two ago, I think often in a crisis, because the organisation feels like it has been the victim of something, whether it's a cyber attack or any other incident, leaders can sometimes focus inwards, and I don't mean inwards on their their people. I mean, inwards on themselves almost. And I think, you know, you would know as a communicator, Alison, that, you know, any communication is successful when you put yourself in the shoes of those who are affected by a situation and with whom you should be communicating. And I think sometimes when leaders are rushing around, focused on trying to address what's going on, there is a danger of not fully understanding the emotions and concerns that their people are going through. And I remember someone once said to me that in any crisis, in very simple terms, there are two questions that your people will be thinking or asking of their leaders. Are they competent and do they care? In other words, if something awful has happened and people have been negatively impacted and my business has been negatively impacted and maybe I'm going to lose my job or my friends are not going to speak to me because my organization is so tainted by what's happened that we're going to become pariahs, what they need to know is my leaders have the skills and the capabilities to steer us successfully through this, and I need to know that they care about me and what's going to happen to me and what's going to happen to all of the other people affected. And I think it's really important that leaders don't just hunker down and get on behind, as you said, that locked door with the blinds down, you know, really trying to deal with the problem, but somewhat oblivious to the ripple effects within the broader organisation.
Yeah, absolutely. Leaders have such an important role, not only in enabling the crisis response, but actually enabling people to move out of that fight, flight or freeze mode that we all go into when a crisis strikes. So they have a role in supporting people, in showing that they care, in showing that they understand the impact, as well as in kind of directing the crisis response and listening. So the best leaders, and again, I've observed brilliant leaders in times of crisis, and I've you know, witnessed leaders who I've felt have been lacking slightly. The brilliant ones are visible. They're not perfect. They don't pretend to be perfect. They acknowledge when they've made mistakes. They acknowledge when they don't yet know something. But they are visible and they are there ready to work alongside their teams to strengthen the organisation, to do right whatever has gone wrong, to protect from harm. And it's obvious that that is the scope of the challenge for them. And so the people around them can kind of feel that positive contagion and can think, yes, this is something that I'm making up my mind up about right now, but I'm also making my mind up about this leadership team. And I trust them. I believe in them. I have confidence in them. I want to work alongside them to kind of enable this crisis response. So that visibility and also that ability to get in and about the organisation and simply to listen, not necessarily always to have all the answers, but to want to know, how does this feel for you? What are you doing? What do you think? Because in a crisis, every single person is affected in the organisation in some way, whether they're directly affected, whether they're the most directly affected crisis victim, whether they feel the harm most directly, they are affected in some way. It is not business as usual for anyone. They're all going above and beyond. They're all outside of their comfort zone. And a leader who can kind of recognise and acknowledge that is much more likely, one, to be able to kind of stabilise people emotionally, psychologically, but also to be able to listen, understand and direct what's needed next.
Yeah, and again, we talk about crises being obviously threat, but also opportunity, not in a Machiavellian way, but, you know, a leader or an organisation which shows itself at its best in a crisis is going to win further respect, trust, loyalty from its team, and it demonstrates that it's truly authentic. Some of the people on this call will know that my biggest and first crisis management hero was Michael Bishop, obviously also from the aviation world, who was the chief executive of British Midland when they had a serious air accident in which 67 people died. But because of his leadership and the way that he cared for both the victims and the people within British Midland, he was loved and admired even more afterwards than he was before. I had the privilege of meeting him last year, and it was very clear even then that he put the people, whether they were the families of the people who were injured or worse in the accident, but also his own people, very much at the heart of his response. Alison, would you agree that sometimes, everyone knows that communication is critical in a crisis? Is internal communication sometimes the poor relation?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely it is. And I think that's something that needs to change. I don't think it's something that is intentional. I don't think people within organisations kind of create a hierarchy and say, well, our staff are the least important. Obviously, sometimes the crisis victims are outside of the organisation, and we always need to focus on the person most directly affected by the crisis at the heart.
Yeah.
So I'm not advocating, some people think that I'm advocating for staff are the most important every single time. I'm not advocating for that. I understand that the crisis victim, the most harmed person, must always be at the heart of the crisis response. But what I do believe is that the people within the organisation are always very, very high up on that hierarchy. They feel the crisis personally every time. When a crisis happens, this week alone, there's been 5, 6, 7 different incidents out in the world that have kind of hit our news screens or our social media or the newspaper stands. In the past 2-3 weeks, there's been much more and much bigger. There are crises happening all the time. And in the outside world, they can sometimes be slightly abstract. Even if we know that they're awful, there are so many other things going on in our world that, we can think that's terrible, or I'm angry about that, or I have a feeling about that, or I'm going to do something differently. When it happens inside the organisation, that happens every single time. The people in the organisation, regardless of how badly harmed they are, or how badly harmed they might be, they have a personal reaction and a personal response to the crisis. So they need really carefully tailored internal communication. But we have tended to focus outside the organisation, partly, I think, because organisations are worried about their external reputation, the media, and so on. Of course, these things are important. Of course, making sure that our customers and our other stakeholders are okay, our shareholders, are sometimes a focus, and so on. Of course, all these people are important. But what I'm saying is that the internal audience is as important, and occasionally more so, because they feel the crisis very deeply, but also they're the people who are potentially going to lead the organisation out of the crisis. An organisation isn't an entity in itself. It isn't a kind of weird blob or a square or a triangle or a building, or it is people. It is a collection of people, and it is all of those people who form the organisation. It is all of those people who form the organisation's reputation. It is all of those people who form whatever happens next. So it's really, really important that we engage with them as well, and we engage with them not just in terms of a kind of remember to send them the press release or remember to stick something on a notice board, but we think intentionally about what they're going to need through the process of crisis.
Absolutely, and just want to echo and add to a couple of the things that you said there. I mean, in a crisis, all stakeholders, and by stakeholders, what we mean is anyone who is impacted by the crisis or anyone that has influence over how it plays out. But all stakeholders are important, but all stakeholders are not equal. And at a time when you will have scarce resource, we know in a crisis there's never enough people or time. It essential to prioritize on those that matter most. And I find it hard to recall a crisis where your own people wouldn't, as a minimum, be one of your top 3 stakeholder groups. And yet, as you say, sometimes they're a little bit further down the list. Alison, I'd said we were going to take questions at the end, but we've got quite a few come in already. So I'm going to put 1 or 2 of them now before we move on. So Kirsten is asking, how do you deal with dominant leadership as opposed to strong leadership, particularly when you might be dealing with very powerful individuals who might not welcome feedback?
Wow, now that's a great question. I think a lot of that comes in the pre-crisis kind of planning. If you have leaders who are perhaps not as encompassing as others, then we really need to be working through those kind of scenario plannings and helping them see what are the outcomes of different types of behaviours, what are the outcomes of different types of messages, what are the outcomes of different types of activities beforehand, so that they can see and they can make up their own mind and understand what is going to be required in different situations before you're in that situation where, you know, it's full throttle in one direction that may not necessarily have the best impact for everyone involved. You need powerful leaders in crisis. You need people who are up for the challenge. What we don't want is we don't want people who are hiding, who are making one decision when they're talking to one person, another decision when they're talking to another person, saying one. You need people who are confident. You need people who are competent. You need people who are in control. But you also need very good listeners. You also need people who are prepared to look at the crisis from lots of different horizons and who are prepared to be adaptable and who recognize that they exist in one part of the organization. They see the organization in one way, but the other people may see the organization in other ways. If we get it right, you know, you gave an example yourself. It's remembered for generations.
Yeah.
If we get it wrong, it's remembered for generations as well. You know, in the book, I talked to Sue Jane Taylor, who was the artist who created the Piper Alpha Memorial. Now, that was back in the 1980s. There was a lot of pain and suffering in that situation that is still remembered to this day, that still causes pain to this day. So leaders need to remember that the decisions they make are not necessarily just about what happens in the moment, but they're gonna be around for a long, long time. So they need to be aware of how things might play forward.
Yeah. Again, a couple of things to add to that. I completely agree with what you just said, Alison. I mean, clearly you do come across the odd leader who is just entirely autocratic and domineering, and in those circumstances there are some people who won't listen to feedback, and sometimes that will work for them and sometimes it won't. There are other leaders who are by nature confident problem solvers, and they may unintentionally get a little bit too tunnel visioned, but they're self-aware. And so what some of the techniques that we put in place with their blessing is that you actually have someone within that crisis management team whose role it is to challenge the prevailing wisdom, and who is empowered and indeed encouraged to put the opposing view to that dominant person, so that they are getting robust challenge to end up with a better decision in the end. Scenario planning, red teaming are other ways of doing that. So I think you can have very strong leaders, but if they also bring emotional intelligence, self-awareness, and a degree of empathy with that as well, then they can be incredibly effective. The ones that only want to hear their own voice and just can't help themselves, then that can be a bit more challenging. I've got an observation from Mark, as he says it's not a quote, not a question, but an anecdote. Mark says, I was in the Holborn office of, sorry, I'm just trying to read it on the pen. I was in the Holborn office of then Burson Marsteller on 7/7. I was coordinating the CMT, and when asked by department/team heads what they could do, we asked them to walk their floors or team areas and sit and talk to their staff. They were briefed on what we knew as facts at the time, asked to confirm the staff member had contacted next of kin, asked the staff member if they had any concerns or worries, childcare or pick up from school, no cash or little cash, etc. And also to ask staff if they had other information, rumour, misinformation, and bring that back to the CMT for action and corroboration. It worked very well and allowed the HR team to then get around staff and sort out issues. Plus, it allowed us to squash rumours and or rebut misinformation. Nice example.
Yeah, perfect example. Those memories that we all have, you know, if you've been involved in crisis before, or if you've been involved in more than one crisis, some of the memories that we take with us, you know, 10, 15, 20 years later, they are the hand on the shoulder, you know, somebody bringing you a cup of tea, somebody asking you if you're okay. Those, I talk about this in the book actually, but you know, those supporting needs are absolutely vital, and people can't really kind of move forward if they don't feel supported and heard within that crisis situation. So it seems like potentially to some people a small thing. It's not a small thing at all. It's massive, and it's so important.
Okay, so we almost kind of touched on the fact that maybe some people, maybe even some organisations, are natural or instinctive communicators, but I know in the book you advocate for an intentional and a proactive and kind of planned way of communicating. And so we haven't got lots of slides in this presentation, but now is probably a good time to run through your 7 S's, Alison, if that works for you.
Absolutely. Well, it fits quite nicely actually, because we were talking about the supporting needs just now. Yeah, in the book I talk about the fact that we are good at planning for crisis communication, crisis response, business resilience, business continuity. All of these things, we're brilliant at it, and it's been based on understanding that's been built up since the 1980s and the 1990s. What I would like to get to the point is that we do the same for internal crisis communication. So just like external crisis communication, I believe that different responses are required in different situations. So we need really good insight. We need insight into the crisis itself. Obviously, different types of crisis require different types of response. I think most people on this call would kind of acknowledge that. But we also need insight into the organisation. What's the culture like? What's the psychological safety like? What are the relationships like? What is the infrastructure like? And so on. We need insight into the people themselves. And all of that enables us to kind of plan ahead, not just for the moment of crisis impact, which is what we do now, or when a crisis strikes, this is going to be our template and we're going to forward it out and so on, but actually thinking about the full process of crisis. How do we take the people in our organisation from pre-crisis, when they could actually be preventing harm from happening in the first place, all the way through to crisis recovery and strengthening? And so in the book, I kind of have come up with a framework, which I called the 7 S of internal crisis communication. And this is based partly on some academic things that are out there already, but more so on my observation of different types of crisis. So in the crises that I've been involved with, I've noticed that if managers rush to kind of fix the crisis too quickly, they'll leave people behind, they'll cause problems. So actually, we always need to focus on the human before we focus on the organisation. And that focus on the human, I think it was Mark who was giving us a really nice example of that earlier on, but that focus on the human must come first. It can be very, very quick. It can be a quick, is everybody okay? Good, we're good, let's go. Or it can take months. It depends on the type of crisis, it depends on the organisation. But the human needs are surviving needs, supporting needs and sense-making needs. Surviving needs in the first place, it's all about protecting from harm. So I believe, a lot of people believe, crisis communication, crisis response isn't about patching up and covering up and plastering over harm. It's about protecting from harm and making sure that it doesn't happen again. So the surviving needs are very directive communication. A lorry's coming along the road, you're standing in the road, get out of the way. It's as simple as that. It's very, very directive. It's very, very simple, very straightforward. The fewer words, the better. And there's no noise around it. It is, what communication do we need to protect people right now, or to enable them to protect others? And I obviously talk about this much more in the book than we have time for just now. Very closely on the back of that, though, it's that supporting information that we were talking about. Are you okay? What do you need to start functioning again within this crisis and within this organization? So, you know, has your pay been affected? Has your place of work been affected? You know, what practical needs do you have? Have you been psychologically or emotionally affected by what's happening? What is stalling you and keeping you in that fight, flight, or freeze mode? And how do we support you to get you out of it? How do we enable you to function in the organization? And then again, very closely on the back of that, it is a hierarchy, but it's a very compressed hierarchy. We have sense-making needs. Now, everyone who kind of reads a lot about PR, comms, and so on will have heard people are talking about sense-making all the time at the moment. Sense-making is actually a concept that was first kind of discussed in crisis terms back in the 1980s. And it's about helping people understand, how do I feel about this situation? And if we can understand how they feel about it, we are more able to predict what are they going to do. So in a crisis, and this is where people make their biggest mistake, you know, when that information isn't coming, just because an organization thinks that, you know, we're not ready to talk, we're not ready to share, we're not going to say anything just yet, we need to get all our ducks in order. People are sense-making already. They're sense-making from silence. They're sense-making from the rumours that they hear. They're sense-making from this and misinformation that they're finding in the outside world. So the sooner that the organisation can actually be involved in kind of framing the crisis, helping people understand what's happened, helping them understand why it's happened, what's needed next, and so on, the quicker they're then going to be able to move on to the organisational needs, which are the stabilising, the stimulating, the sustaining, and the strengthening needs, which is what our leaders often want to move into quickly. So we do those 3 human needs first, and then it's about, how do we stabilise the situation? People are now slightly more confident in the situation than they were before. How do we kind of get them ready to start fully functioning? How do we get them ready to start advocating? How do we get them ready to start working again, or whatever it is that's needed? So we stabilise, and then we stimulate the crisis response. Get everyone going, listen to ideas, understand the scope of the challenge. And obviously in different types of crisis, this all looks very different, but the process, I believe, is the same. So we start thinking about, you know, how do we get people energized again? How do we get them ready to deal with the crisis, to move forward? And then as we do that, we recognize the crises are long. It's not just about that acute moment of impact, but it's actually a long process. It's exhausting. You know, the adrenaline's up at the beginning and then it drops. Again, if you've been there, you'll remember this. How do we sustain people? How do we make sure that they're valued, that their ideas are heard, that they're recognized, that we're pinpointing different milestones on the path to recovery? How do we move from that point where the communication was very directive and very instructive to a point where the communication is really encompassing, involving everyone in the response, hearing, and if appropriate, only if appropriate, celebrating people in the crisis response as we move back to strengthening the organisation. I do believe we can get stronger out of crises. I do believe crises bring opportunity. There are some awful, awful, awful crises that will stay with people, as we said, for generations. We can still learn from those. But there are other crises where, you know, the human harm or the harmful impact can be overcome fairly quickly. The organisation can strengthen, it can recover, and it, you know, it can go on to really thrive. I believe we can do that often, but we need to put the human beings first for organisations that are going to achieve that in the long term. So that's basically what that framework is all about. There's lots of different kind of strategic tips and ideas and so on. They're all observed. They're not really, you know, super academic, although they're based on academic understanding. But I do think if we can think intentionally about human needs, if we can think intentionally about organisational needs, if we can remember to be strategic, joining the dots, keeping the internal comms response closely aligned with the crisis management response and what people need at different points and so on, and recognising this is a process that's changing all the time. So one message, one email doesn't fit all. Different communication approaches are required at different times. Sometimes there's a need for a really clear message from the top of the organisation. Yes. Other times we need to trust the line managers to understand what their employees need now and to translate the crisis messages and to enable those line managers to kind of deliver the communication that their team needs. So there's lots of different things that people need at different times. But I think if we can go through this process, or at least consider this process, it makes us much more able to be proactive, forward-looking, forward-thinking, and importantly, be ready, because we're not facing every single milestone the minute it hits. We know that it's coming, and we know that we need to be prepared for it.
Yeah, again, we talk a lot about how you can get ahead of the crisis, how you can influence the crisis rather than simply reacting to what's happening and ending up, you know, almost literally behind the curve or chasing the crisis. And I think what's so powerful about your 7 S's is it helps you to ensure that you are delivering the right type of communication at the right time, because what might land perfectly and brilliantly on day 3 might be utterly counterproductive on day 1, but you wouldn't realize that unless you had a model or a structure like this.
Yeah, exactly. It's such an important point, because, you know, I read a lot of blogs and follow a lot of people on LinkedIn, and quite often I hear people say, this is the way forward with crisis communication. They'll take one case study and they'll say, wasn't this done brilliantly? And it was in that situation. Yeah. But if you were to lift those messages or lift that approach and try and deliver them in a different organization or a different crisis, or even just at a different crisis point, you would be facing bigger problems. And I think that nuance, that understanding of all of these shades of grey in crisis, that understanding that we need to look at the differences in situations as much as we need to look at the similarities, and we need to really understand the human beings inside and outside of the organisation and understand their experience of the crisis at different times in order to converse meaningfully. And I use the word converse deliberately because I do believe crisis communication is a two-way process rather than just sending stuff out. You know, that's what makes us effective, not lifting one best practice case study that one organisation kind of delivered well and saying this is now the way forward for everyone.
And that's a good cue for me again to get on my soapbox, because that's one of the reasons why we at Insignia are not big advocates of very prescriptive step-by-step playbooks for your crisis management plan, because clearly there is benefit in checklists, but your plans and your processes should provide a framework for you then to exercise your knowledge, your skills, your experience, your emotional intelligence to come up with the right decisions and actions at that time. It should be a way of you working effectively together, not, you know, an IKEA toolkit to get you to the right answer. As my IKEA toolkit, it would fall apart anyway, because I'm hoping for an IKEA piece of furniture. But yeah, ultimately, structures, plans, processes are essential. It gives you the launch pad from which to apply really good judgment and decision making. We have about 15 minutes to go, and I'm going to move to a question from Beata. Nice to have you on the call, Beata. She says, how much does preparation pay off, i.e. companies that are already practicing good times what you set out would be important in crisis, e.g. psychological safety, engagement, transparency, etc. I'll say a couple of words in general terms, and then maybe Alison specifically as it comes to internal comms. A crisis is an extraordinary moment for an organisation. If it's not extraordinary or unusual, then the organisation clearly has got even bigger problems. But because it's extraordinary and unusual and requires different ways of thinking and different ways of working, planning and preparation, and most importantly rehearsal, is critical. You know, when emotions are high, when adrenaline is flowing at 1,000,000 miles an hour, having that mental muscle memory and those processes and that understanding of how each other work within that team, I know it can be the difference between success and failure. But what's your experience, Alison?
I fully agree. I mean, planning is important for so many different reasons. It's important in the first instance, as you say, for that kind of building that muscle memory, building that confidence in the team. But it's also important for identifying what might go wrong with the crisis response, what might we respond in different types of situations. I've mentioned different types of crisis already, but I really strongly believe, having experienced many different types of crisis myself or worked through them, different responses are required in different crisis types. So what we would do in a technical malfunction, for example, would be completely different than what we would do in a cyber incident. So we need to be able to understand how people are going to feel in different types of situation and be prepared for them. But the planning, from an internal comms perspective, I think it's important to start early as well, because, you know, as the person who asked the question said, it's all about establishing those strong relationships within the organisation. It's about establishing, you know, how well do we work together? How do we know these people? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What are our expectations of each other when things go wrong? What is the level of psychological safety in this organisation? Can we come together and surface and tackle issues in a very productive way that is going to, minimise harm? Or are we all going to sit on the sidelines and watch somebody else's problem bubble up and bubble up and bubble up until it becomes everybody's problem? You know, a good, robust culture of crisis planning, crisis awareness, and talking about crisis in a positive way can actually prevent so many of these problems from happening in the first place. So my belief is that crisis planning is valuable, not just to deal with the incident when it happens, but also potentially to stop it from happening in the first place. So short answer, yes. Very important.
Absolutely. So we've got now, just under 10 minutes, and we must get to your discount code by the hour, but a couple more questions. A really interesting one from Lisa. I think it's Lisa, Based on the work my team did during and following COVID-19, it was clear that female leaders were able to make better decisions quickly in the crisis. The countries that had female leaders were more proactive. Any thoughts on this? Well, I think that's completely wrong. No, I don't. I'll let you go first, Alison.
Okay, I will. I don't necessarily, in my own experience, see it to be a male-female thing. I have worked with brilliant male crisis leaders. I've worked with female crisis leaders as well. Some of them have been great. Some of them less so. Same with men. So I don't think it's a male-female thing. What I do think it is an empathy thing. And often females do have higher levels of empathy. And often they are better listeners. And so I think possibly it's that. I know exactly the females that you're talking about, or the females that I think you're talking about, and males that I think you're talking about. And we can see, you know, the personality differences and the differences in character and so on. So I think, yes, I think it's more to do with the ability to show empathy and to show compassion in times of crisis, but also, as I said before, to be strong, to be controlled, to be confident, to show competence, and so on. Those mix of the two, I think, is what makes a great crisis leader.
Fabulous. Thank you, Alison. What about messaging when we think about internal versus external communication? Clearly there needs to be nuance and some targeting, but where do you sit in terms of the difference between messaging or the tailoring of messaging?
Yeah,
what's
brilliant.
Your view?
Brilliant question, because actually, since I've written the book, I've been training in this subject for years now, and I've been talking about this subject for years, and up until now, everyone's basically agreed with me, which has been lovely. But when I wrote the book, a couple of people had said, not keen on this focus on internal. I think you're kind of in danger of fragmenting the crisis response. And that's not my intention at all. It's about personalizing the crisis response. It's not about fragmenting the crisis response. The best crisis I've worked in, I've been a comms person, sometimes internal and usually, to be honest, internal and external comms person. Working with crisis management, working with business continuity, working with organizational leaders, it is a team effort. And internal crisis communication and external crisis communication, I'm only using them as descriptions because I want people to think intentionally about internal comms. Yeah. But actually, the two need to come together. The overall, the core crisis communication values and the crisis communication messages have to be closely aligned, because if they're not, we can't be saying one thing externally and another thing internally, because people will notice, people will be aware of that. It will not be authentic. But what I'm talking about here is personalizing the messages. So to take a press release, for example, that has been written for somebody outside the organization and then just forwarding that blanket to everyone inside the organization and assuming that they'll be satisfied, they won't be satisfied. They'll be frustrated. They'll be disempowered, because actually you're not giving them any direction or instruction about what they need to do next. They'll be undervalued because you won't be recognizing that actually this is a very unique situation for them and a very disruptive situation for them. So the same one consistent message, while some people would advocate for that in times of crisis, I would say at the core, of course, but if we don't personalize, then we actually we lessen the desire from our staff to advocate for the organization. We lessen their ability to act because they don't know actually what it is that we want them to do, what we don't want them to do, and so on. So potentially we're disempowering the whole of the crisis response. In the worst case scenario, you know, we have people like the example on the slide earlier, where they're going to the BBC and telling people how awful it is. Yeah. You know, passionate people can become very outspoken against their own organisation in times of crisis, when they feel they're not being heard, when they feel they're not being valued, when they feel they have important points to make that are not being recognised and accepted by the kind of leaders that the person who was asking the question really, really early on, you know, are kind of not listening to them. So the messages, I think, the messages are the same, but they need to recognise different needs and the impact of meeting those needs, and why, thinking, why are we giving this particular piece of communication to this particular individual or group or whatever at this time.
So, as you say, consistent but personalised.
Yeah.
I'm going to move us forward, because I always promise everyone that we will finish by the hour. We've taken almost an hour of your time. I feel like we could have taken an hour and a half. There are a number of questions that haven't been answered. Alison, with your agreement, I'm going to forward them to you. I will respond as well, but I do want to get to the end of the last few slides. We have had 107 people on this call, or registering for this call. We have 60 people joining us at our conference in 3 weeks time, and the reason I'm mentioning that is there clearly is an appetite for crisis management, interaction, insight and chat, and we are therefore considering launching a crisis management community for 2026, which would include these things and more. And just as a very, very rough indicator of whether we might get this off the ground and whether there's appetite for it, I would love it if the people on this call could scan the QR code and vote yes or no. The one thing that isn't mentioned here that would also be part of it is AI-powered crisis management tools and resources, which would be customizable to your own organization. There would be a subscription fee. So just really interested to get some kind of handle on whether there would be interest or appetite for that. Could you vote for me, please? That would be much appreciated. And by the way, apologies for those of you who would like or even asked us for a place at the conference but have not been able to join us, because we are completely and utterly packed out. So we are taking out the O2 Arena next year to make sure that we can accommodate everyone. But I do apologise for the fact that we've not been able to have everyone at the event that we would have liked. Okay, so thank you for those of you who have voted. Oh, well, that's fairly reassuring. Okay, I'm going to canter through the next few slides because of time. And so, as promised, I wanted everyone to have the opportunity to get hold of Alison's book with the 25% discount code. Go to the Kogan page website, put Alison Arnot 25 in, and you will get a copy of the book at a discounted price. Alison, genuinely, we've had a lot of people on this call. We've had a lot of questions, and again, I apologise that we haven't been able to deal with all of them. I've enjoyed shooting the breeze with you. It's been a really stimulating discussion, so thank you. For everyone else, as always, this session has been recorded and will be available via a link on our website afterwards. We'll send that link via an email. If there are other questions arising that you didn't have time to ask for either Alison or myself, you have our contact details there. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for participating so fully. And Alison, thank you in particular for what was a really fascinating, enlightening and insightful presentation. So thank you. Thanks everyone else, and I wish you all a crisis-free afternoon.